Have you ever felt a moment so quiet, so still, that it almost feels unnatural? As if the world itself is holding its breath? But then, just as you begin to relax, something changes. A sound. A whisper. A warning. They say the most terrifying sounds aren't the ones that roar, but the ones that barely make a sound at all. The wind outside howled, carrying thick sheets of snow that swallowed everything in sight. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, casting long, flickering shadows against the wooden walls. The warmth wrapped around me like a familiar embrace, pushing back the biting cold that clawed at the windows. Then I heard it. Scratch. A faint, almost imperceptible sound against the door. Soft. Hesitant. I ignored it. Just the wind, I told myself. Maybe a branch swaying, brushing against the wood. The forest had a way of playing tricks on your ears, especially on nights like this. Then came another sound. A whine. Weak. Barely there. My fingers tightened around the book in my lap. My body stiffened. That wasn't the wind. For a moment I held my breath, waiting. Listening. Silence stretched through the room, broken only by the occasional snap of the fire. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe. Scratch. Scratch. Whine. This time, the sound was softer. More desperate. I set my book down, my pulse quickening. A part of me wanted to ignore it. I had spent years in solitude, far away from people, far away from everything. I liked my isolation. Whatever was out there, it wasn't my concern. But then, the whimper came again. And this time, it was fading. I exhaled slowly, running a hand down my face. Whatever it was alive. It was suffering. Reluctantly, I rose to my feet. The floor was cool against my bare skin as I moved toward the door. My fingers hovered over the handle. A beat of hesitation. I didn't know what I would find on the other side. Part of me didn't want to know. Another weak, shuddering whimper. I gritted my teeth and pulled the door open. The cold hit me like a slap. The wind roared past, stealing the warmth from my skin in an instant. Snow flurried through the open doorway, making it difficult to see. Then I saw it. A pair of eyes, golden brown, wide with fear. A German shepherd, its fur caked with snow and ice, its ribs faintly visible beneath its thick coat. It stood there, trembling violently, its legs barely able to hold its weight. For a second, we just stared at each other. Then, the dog took a single, shaky step forward. And collapsed. Everything inside me jolted. Without thinking, I lunged forward, dropping to my knees in the freezing snow. My hands found the dog's body. It was ice cold. No strength. No resistance. Just fragile, shallow breaths. Hey, stay with me! My voice was barely a whisper. I scooped him into my arms, ignoring the sting of the frozen fur against my skin. The wind howled as I stumbled back inside, kicking the door shut behind me. His body lay limp against my chest. Too still. Too light. I tightened my grip, heart hammering. Come on, don't give up on me now. The moment I stepped inside, I kicked the door shut, sealing out the brutal wind. My breath came in quick, visible puffs as I stared down at the lifeless bundle in my arms. The weight of him, too light. His body, too still. His fur was wet, crusted with ice, and his ribs were faintly visible beneath his thick coat. I moved fast, laying him down near the fireplace. The flickering flames bathed him in a soft, golden glow, but it wasn't enough. His body still trembled violently, his breaths shallow and uneven. Come on, buddy! My voice was barely above a whisper. I grabbed the thickest blanket I could find, draping it over him, tucking the edges in to trap whatever warmth I could. But he didn't react. His body lay limp, his paws twitching slightly from the cold. Panic pressed against my chest. I knelt beside him, pressing my hands against his fur. He felt frozen, like a body left out in the snow too long. I started rubbing. Hard. His back, his sides, his legs, trying to bring circulation back, trying to force warmth into his frozen limbs. His paws were like ice blocks. I grabbed one, cupping it between my palms, rubbing vigorously, trying to restore life to his veins. "Stay with me," I murmured. "You're not giving up, you hear me?" But he barely stirred. I clenched my jaw and kept going, pressing my fingers deep into his fur, massaging warmth into his stiff body. Minutes passed, maybe more. My hands burned from the friction, but still, I didn't stop. Then, finally, his tail moved. A small flick. Barely noticeable. But it was something. I exhaled sharply, but I wasn't celebrating yet. He was still too weak. His breathing was barely there. His body was too cold. I needed to warm him from the inside. Scrambling to my feet, I ran to the kitchen, yanked open a cupboard, and grabbed a bowl. The tap water was ice cold. I let it run for a moment, watching the steam rise as it warmed to the right temperature. Not too hot. Not too cold. Just enough to help. I dampened a towel, letting it soak in the lukewarm water before wringing it out. Then I hurried back, kneeling beside him again. Carefully, I lifted his head, supporting him as gently as I could. "Come on, buddy, just a sip." I dipped my fingers into the water and brushed them against his nose. Nothing. I tried again, letting a few drops fall onto his tongue. A faint flicker in his eyes. Just for a second. "That's it," I whispered. "You can do this." I tried again. This time, his tongue barely moved, lapping up the tiniest sip. Relief crashed over me. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A sign that he was fighting. Slowly, I kept coaxing him, drop by drop. His ears twitched slightly. His chest rose just a little more with each breath. I placed my hand over his ribs, feeling the slow, weak thrum of his heartbeat. Unsteady, but still there. "You're safe now," I murmured, running my fingers gently across his damp fur. "I've got you." Outside, the storm raged on, the wind shrieking through the trees, covering the world in ice and darkness. I wanted to know where he came from. How he got here. Why he was alone. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, the only thing that mattered was making sure he survived the night. The storm hadn't let up. If anything, it had gotten worse. The wind roared through the trees like a living beast, rattling the windows, making the walls groan under its force. Snow battered against the cabin, thick and relentless. But inside, near the fireplace, there was warmth. I sat on the floor beside the dog, my back resting against the couch. His breathing was still shallow, his body still weak, but there was life in him now. A faint, flickering ember. I had wrapped another blanket around him, tucking it in snugly. He hadn't moved much, but every now and then, his paws twitched. His ears gave small, involuntary flicks. Little signs that he was fighting. That he wasn't giving up. I wasn't sure why, but I stayed. I could have gone back to my chair, back to my book, back to ignoring the outside world like I always did. But I didn't. Instead, I watched him. There was something about him, something I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the way he had shown up at my door, out of all places. Maybe it was the way he had collapsed, as if he had spent every last ounce of strength just to get here. Or maybe it was the feeling in my chest. An unfamiliar weight. A pull. I exhaled slowly, running a hand through my hair. I wasn't used to feeling this way. The fire crackled beside us, the only other sound besides the raging storm. Shadows danced across the walls, shifting and swaying with the flickering flames. Then movement. My breath caught. His eyes fluttered, just slightly, before opening. Golden brown, deep and weary, but aware. He blinked sluggishly, his gaze locking onto mine. I froze. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. No sound. No movement. Just the quiet exchange between two strangers. Then, his tail moved. A slow, weak wag against the floor. Something tight in my chest loosened. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Hey there," I murmured. My voice was softer than I expected. His ears twitched slightly. He didn't move his head, didn't lift himself up, but he was looking at me. Really looking. A silent understanding passed between us. He didn't know me. I didn't know him. But somehow, it didn't matter. I pushed myself up with a sigh. You must be starving. I moved to the kitchen, grabbing a small pot and filling it with water. I set it over the stove, adding a bit of chicken broth, something light, something he could handle. As I waited for it to warm, I glanced back. He was still watching me. Even in his weakened state, his eyes followed my every move, cautious but steady. I didn't know what he had been through. I didn't know what had led him here, half dead and alone. But I knew one thing. This dog had been fighting for a long time. And for the first time in a while, he didn't have to fight alone. When the broth was ready, I poured a small amount into a bowl and carefully knelt beside him. Here, I said, placing it near his nose. Try a little. He sniffed weakly. His nose twitched. Then, slowly, his tongue flicked out, lapping at the liquid. A breath of relief left me. He drank slowly, carefully. A few sips at a time, his body still weak, but no longer lifeless. I sat back, watching, an odd warmth settling in my chest. He was going to make it. I was sure of it. Then, scratch. I stiffened. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Scratch. Scratch. My pulse quickened. The dog's ears perked. His body was too weak to move, but his gaze flickered toward the door. For a long moment I didn't breathe. I had thought the storm had brought me one lost soul tonight. But now, I wasn't so sure. The scratching came again. I stared at the door, my breath caught in my throat. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin, but I knew what I heard. It wasn't the storm. It was something else. Someone else. The older shepherd, still weak but awake, lifted his head slightly. His ears twitched, his gaze locked on the door. He had heard it too. Scratch. Scratch. Whine. My chest tightened. I hesitated. My body was already tense from the last time I'd opened that door. The last time, I had found a dying dog on my porch, barely clinging to life. And now, there was another. I swallowed hard and stood, moving slowly toward the door. My feet felt heavier with every step, my fingers colder as they hovered over the handle. Then, I pulled it open. The storm hit instantly, a violent gust of wind tearing into the cabin, forcing me to squint against the swirling snow. But there, in the middle of it all, barely visible against the whiteout, stood another German shepherd. Smaller. Younger. Weaker. His legs trembled beneath him, his fur matted with ice, his body barely holding itself up. His head was low, eyes filled with the same desperate plea I had seen before. Behind me, the older dog let out a soft, weak whimper. And then, his tail moved. A slow, faint wag. My breath hitched. They knew each other. The younger dog took one step forward, then collapsed. Instinct took over. I lunged, catching his fragile body before he hit the frozen ground. He was even lighter than the first, his fur rough under my fingertips. He was freezing, shaking violently in my arms. Jesus, hold on, buddy. I turned, carrying him inside, kicking the door shut behind me. The older shepherd lifted his head, watching as I laid the younger one down near the fire. His tail gave another weak wag, his body shifting slightly as if he wanted to get closer but didn't have the strength. I moved quickly, grabbing another blanket, wrapping the younger one just as I had done before. His body barely responded. I felt the weight of the moment settle in my chest. They weren't just two strays who had wandered here by accident. They were family. And something had driven them here. I sat back, running a hand down my face. The storm still raged outside, but for the first time, I felt the tension shift. It wasn't just about keeping them alive anymore. I needed to know why they were here. And as the storm finally began to ease, I knew I had to find out. Morning came slowly. The fire had burned low, filling the cabin with a soft, fading warmth. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind an eerie, unnatural silence. I sat in my chair, a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, my eyes fixed on the two sleeping dogs near the fireplace. The older one, stronger now, his breathing steady, lay curled around the younger one, as if shielding him. The smaller shepherd, still weak, rested his head against his companion's side, their bodies rising and falling in quiet unison. They had survived the night. But something still wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't just stumbled onto my doorstep by chance. The way they had arrived, separately in the middle of the worst storm of the season, felt deliberate. Like they were running from something. Or someone. I exhaled slowly, setting my cup down. My gaze drifted toward the window, where the world outside had been transformed overnight. A fresh blanket of snow covered everything, pristine and untouched, except for one thing. Tracks. I stood, moving closer to the window. 2 sets of paw prints, leading straight to my cabin. Their path was uneven, jagged, evidence of how weak they had been when they arrived. But then I saw something else. Something that sent an icy chill crawling up my spine. Footprints. Human footprints. I frowned. The tracks started from the same place deep in the woods. They followed alongside the paw prints, leading toward my cabin. But they never led away. My stomach twisted. Someone had been out there with them. And now they were gone. I glanced back at the dogs, still sleeping, unaware of the unease settling deep in my chest. Whoever had been with them, they hadn't come to my door. Had they left them behind? Or were they still out there? I clenched my jaw, grabbed my coat, and stepped outside. The cold hit instantly, sharp and unforgiving, but I barely felt it. My focus was on the tracks, on the unsettling story they told. I followed them, my boots crunching against the snow, my breath fogging in the air. The prints led me away from the cabin, past the trees, deeper into the forest. The further I went, the more my unease grew. The paw prints wavered, showing signs of exhaustion, of struggle. But the human footprints? They were erratic. Uneven. Like whoever made them had been stumbling. Or running. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Something had happened out here. And whatever it was, I was about to find out. The forest was eerily silent. Even with the snow crunching beneath my boots, I felt the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. The air was colder here, heavier, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. The tracks led deeper, winding between the bare, frost-covered trunks, until they finally stopped. I froze. Ahead of me, half buried in the snow, stood a shed. It was old, far older than it should have been. The wood was warped, the roof sagging under the weight of the snow. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Something about it sent a shiver down my spine. I took a slow step forward. Then another. The closer I got, the stronger the feeling of unease became. I reached for the door, hesitated, then pushed it open. The stench hit me instantly. Damp wood. Rusted metal. Something else, something faintly sour, like decay. My stomach clenched. The inside was dim, the weak morning light filtering through the cracks in the walls. Dust swirled in the air as I stepped inside, my breath visible in the cold. Then I saw them. Cages. Lined against the far wall. Empty now, but unmistakable. The metal bars were bent in places, rusted and clawed. Some had been gnawed through, frantic, desperate attempts to escape. I swallowed hard, my fingers brushing against one of the bars. It was ice cold, the rust flaking beneath my touch. The realization hit me like a fist to the gut. This wasn't just a shed. It had been a prison. I scanned the floor, scattered remnants of what had been left behind. Old blankets stiff with age. Broken bowls, some overturned, others cracked. Paw prints, long since dried into the wooden planks. The dogs had been here. And not just them. I moved deeper into the shed, my eyes landing on a small wooden table in the corner. Something was resting on it, half covered in dust. A notebook. My pulse quickened. I reached for it, brushing away the dirt before flipping it open. Pages filled with scribbled notes, dates, descriptions, each one more unsettling than the last. Then my eyes landed on a single entry. The ink was smudged, but the words were still clear. Subject number 12, male German Shepherd. Strong, obedient. High resale value. My blood ran cold. They weren't just abandoned. They were being sold. The words on the page blurred as my pulse pounded in my ears. High resale value. I stared at the entry, my grip tightening on the notebook. My breath came in slow, shallow drags, the weight of what I had just uncovered pressing down on me. This was no accident. These dogs, they had been property. The thought made my stomach turn. Then, a rustling sound. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees groaning under the weight of the snow. This was something else. Someone else. I turned my head sharply, eyes narrowing toward the forest beyond the shed. The morning light barely cut through the trees, casting long, jagged shadows across the snow. And in those shadows, a figure stood watching me. My breath hitched. They weren't moving. Just standing there. Silent. Watching. A chill ran down my spine, colder than the wind biting at my skin. Then, behind me, a low growl. The sound was deep, rumbling, filled with warning. I glanced down. The older shepherd had followed me. He stood just outside the shed, his fur bristling, his body tense, his golden brown eyes locked onto the figure in the trees. Another growl, sharper this time. His tail was low, stiff, his posture rigid with fear and fury. He knew. He knew who this was. My fingers curled tighter around the notebook. The figure took a step forward. I swallowed hard, my heart slamming against my ribs. The shepherd bared his teeth, his stance shifting, ready to defend. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Whoever this was, they weren't just passing through. And I wasn't sure I wanted to know what they were about to do next. The figure stepped forward, slow and deliberate. As the dim light caught his face, my stomach twisted. A man, weathered, rugged, maybe in his 40s. His clothes were thick, meant for the cold, but worn, dirt-streaked. His boots crunched against the snow as he moved closer. But it was his eyes that made my skin crawl. Cold. Calculating. And locked onto the notebook in my hands. "That doesn't belong to you," he growled. My grip tightened. I felt the weight of the pages, the inked evidence of something sinister. My blood was still running cold from what I had just read. But I didn't flinch. "These dogs don't belong to you either," I shot back. A smirk flickered across his lips, but it wasn't amusement. It was something else. Something uneasy. Behind me, the older shepherd stepped forward, placing himself directly in front of me. His fur bristled, his body stiff, his stance protective. A deep, warning growl rumbled from his chest. The man's smirk faded slightly. He shifted, glancing between me and the dog. "You're meddling in things you don't understand," he muttered, his voice lower this time. The shepherd's growl turned into a sharp, ferocious bark. The man flinched. It was subtle, but I saw it, the flicker of fear in his eyes. I took a step forward, my heart still hammering, but my voice steady. "I'm reporting everything," I said. "You'll pay for this." His jaw tightened. For a moment, he just stood there, like he was weighing his options. Then, without another word, he turned and bolted. I watched as he disappeared into the trees, his footsteps fading into the silence of the woods. The shepherd remained frozen, his body still tense, ears perked, eyes locked on the spot where the man had been. Even when the forest fell still again, I knew this wasn't over. The forest was still. Quiet. For the first time in hours, the storm had passed, leaving behind only the crisp bite of cold air. But I wasn't standing around to enjoy the silence. I hurried back toward the cabin, my breath visible in the freezing air. The older shepherd stayed close, his body still tense, his eyes flicking toward the tree line every few seconds, as if expecting the man to return. The younger dog was too weak to walk, so I carried him against my chest, his frail body barely stirring. His breaths were soft, steady, but he was exhausted. By the time I reached the cabin, I threw the door open and stepped inside, kicking it shut behind me. The warmth hit immediately, the fire still burning low in the hearth. The older shepherd walked straight to the fireplace and collapsed onto the blanket. His body finally relaxed, his chest rising and falling in deep, even breaths. I knelt down, setting the younger one beside him. He curled into the warmth, his small body trembling slightly before settling against his companion. They didn't just know each other. They belonged together. I exhaled slowly and grabbed my phone. My fingers hesitated over the screen for only a second before I dialed. The moment someone picked up, my voice was firm. I need to report something. I told them everything. The shed. The cages. The notebook. The man. The person on the other end didn't ask many questions, they just promised someone would come. I hung up, staring at the phone for a moment. Even if they found him, I knew he'd disappear. People like him always did. But no matter what happened next, these dogs weren't his anymore. They never would be. I let out a slow breath and sat down on the floor, my back against the couch. The older shepherd lifted his head slightly, studying me. Then, after a long moment, he let out a deep sigh and rested his head on my lap. My throat tightened. The younger pup curled closer to him, pressing his small frame into his warmth. For the first time since I found them, they were both safe. I ran my fingers through the older one's fur, feeling the roughness of it, the scars hidden beneath. He had been through so much. He had survived. Hero, I murmured. His ear twitched slightly, but he didn't lift his head. Yeah. That was his name. Because after everything, after the fight, after protecting me without hesitation. That's exactly what he was. A hero. I leaned back against the couch, closing my eyes for just a moment as the fire crackled beside us. They had come to me for a reason. They needed a home. And deep down I realized I needed them too. Hero taught me something I'll never forget. Loyalty isn't just a word. It's an unbreakable bond. Dogface, what do you think? Was Hero always meant to find me, or was he simply searching for a new beginning? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Fire, if you loved this heartwarming story of loyalty and fate, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more incredible dog stories. Your support helps us share more tales of courage, companionship, and second chances. Memo: have you ever had a special bond with a dog? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. Whether it's a rescue, a lifelong friendship, or a moment that changed everything, let's celebrate the love and loyalty of our four-legged friends. Paw Prints, thanks for watching, and until next time, take care and cherish every moment with your furry companions. Raising hands.